At 14,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea, with his Corsair hanging on the edge of a stall, Robert Hanson rolled inverted and looked straight down into hell. Directly beneath his canopy, maybe 2,000 feet below, a loose halo of Japanese fighters was wheeling in the morning sun, white and green zeros and darker specks that he knew would be Ki-44s. 21 aircraft in all, according to the warning call that had just gone out on the radio. Off to the east, 18 Grumman TBF Avengers, torpedo bombers heavy with ordnance, were droning towards Simpson Harbor. They were fat, slow, and absolutely vital. Somewhere under that thin cloud layer lay Rabaul, the bastion that had chewed up Allied air crews since 1942. And now, as those Avengers pushed in at 12,000 feet, the fortress was spitting fighters at them like hornets. Behind Hanson, in the empty high blue, there were precisely 0 friendly fighters in position to help. The other 7 F4U Corsairs of his section were back with the bombers, doing what doctrine and common sense told them to do: hold high cover, keep the formation intact, and let the enemy come to them. Hanson had rolled out of that formation 20 seconds earlier. Now his Corsair's big gull wings were edge-on to the earth. Gravity was about to grab hold. The altimeter unwound. The engine note changed pitch as the nose fell through the horizon. Below, the Japanese formation was just beginning to react, elements peeling, leaders turning. He had perhaps 3 seconds before those 21 fighters scattered into a chaotic three-dimensional knife fight. 3 seconds to decide whether he was going to do what every manual, every tactics lecture, and his own commanding officer had told him not to do: dive alone into a formation that outnumbered him 21-1. By any sane measure, the math said he'd be dead within 90 seconds. Robert Butcher.
Bob. Hanson pushed the stick forward and committed. To understand why 8 Marine Corsairs and 18 Avengers were out there at all that morning, so far from friendly ground, so deep inside the teeth of Japanese defenses, you have to look at the map the way the planners saw it. At the northeastern tip of New Britain, tucked into a natural harbor fringed by volcanic ridges, sat Rabaul. Simpson Harbor was the center of that fortress. Sheltered anchors, repair facilities, fuel storage, anti-aircraft batteries cut into slopes, flak towers and pits flanking every approach. Fighter strips fanned out on the flat ground nearby like the spokes of a wheel. Tunnels and revetments linked everything. For 2 years, Rabaul had been the central hub of Japanese air power in the South and Southwest Pacific. From there, they'd struck Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomons. Every attempt to hit it back had come with a butcher's bill. Japanese intelligence knew the Allies had finally built enough forward airstrips to mass serious force. It also knew, more or less, what those strips held. By late January 1944, they'd counted roughly 70 serviceable fighters around Rabaul, Zeros, Tonys, and a handful of newer types. Radar stations on nearby heights watched the sea, plotting approaching raids. Range and bearing went out over radio nets to ready squadrons. The Americans knew that too. On January 30th, 1944, that knowledge met the needs of strategy. Heavy bombers from the 5th Air Force, RNZAF, and Marines had been hammering airfields and infrastructure around Rabaul for weeks. It was working slowly. But ships in Simpson Harbor were still floating, and every day they did, supplies and men moved. To put real hurt on that harbor, you needed torpedoes in the water. Enter Avenger crews. 18 TBFs were assigned that day to hit shipping in Simpson Harbor. Big, rugged, and slow, they would fly in at around 180 knots, low enough and straight enough on the final run that any interception would have a field day if they got into position. Escort strength, 8 F4U Corsairs from Marine Fighting Squadron 2 and 15, VMF 215, the Fighting Corsairs. On the flight line at Piva North Airfield on Bougainville, that equation was written across the morning. Avengers, 8 fighters, 70 known enemy fighters at Rabaul, an approach path that ran straight through carefully constructed kill zones of radar-guided intercepts and flak. It looked, even to hardened Pacific veterans, like a bad bet.
One of the men strapping in to make it anyway had already developed a habit of doing just that. First Lieutenant Robert M. Hanson was 23 years old. He had been born in Lucknow, India, the son of Methodist missionaries. He'd grown up dodging bullock carts and playing grappling games with local boys that later turned into a talent for wrestling when his family returned to the States. In college in California, he became known on the mat for a particular style, relentless, technical, willing to take risks in pursuit of a clean throw. When war came, he joined the Marines and went into aviation. Combat shaped that aggressive precision into something much sharper. Hanson arrived in the South Pacific in mid-1943 with VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron under Major Pappy Boyington. The F4U Corsair was still a relatively new beast in Marine service then, all muscle and quirks, with a long nose that made landing on carriers unforgiving, but perfectly suited to the rough coral strips the Marines were using. His first kill came on August 4th, 1943, a Kawasaki Ki 61 Tony over the island of Vella La Vella. It was a clean engagement, spot, position, attack, full deflection boost. Just a wing torn off, parachute opening below, the kind of kill that looked textbook in the gun camera. By the end of that month, he had 2 confirmed victories. Then came November and Empress Augusta Bay. On November 1st, 1943, as Marines were clawing out a beachhead at Cape Torquina on Bougainville, VMF 214 and other squadrons flew cover. Hanson, separated from his section in the swirling air battle, found a formation of 6 Japanese torpedo bombers making a run on the landing ships. He attacked them alone. Diving through them again and again, he forced 3 to jettison their torpedoes early to evade his fire, dropping harmlessly into the sea, then shot down the other 3 outright. It was the kind of move that got an admiring mention in the day's teletype summaries and a raised eyebrow from majors and colonels reading between the lines. On that mission, the rear gunner of one of the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes got lucky. A burst stitched across Hanson's Corsair, shredding a wing root and rupturing a fuel tank. Gasoline streamed back along the fuselage, then lit off. He rode the burning fighter down to a controlled ditching in the open ocean, hauled himself into his rubber raft, and spent 6 hours alone on the Pacific swells before the destroyer USS Sigourney found him after dark. It was a story that could have ended there, with a young lieutenant's name on a missing in action list and a paragraph in a squadron history. Hanson, like his Corsair, seemed resistant to that kind of finality. In October 1943, after VMF 214 rotated out, Hanson transferred to VMF 215, the Fighting Corsairs. The unit flew from strips on Vella La Vella and later Bougainville, covering operations up the Solomon's Chain toward Rabaul. By early January 1944, his total stood at 5 confirmed kills. Respectable, not spectacular, somewhere in the crowded middle of the Pacific seaboard. Then something shifted. In the span of less than 3 weeks, over and around Simpson Harbor and its approaches, Bob Hanson went from good pilot to something else entirely. On January 14, 1944, VMF 215 was escorting high-altitude bombers into the Rabaul area. Hanson got separated during the melee. Alone at altitude, he found himself above a loose formation of Japanese fighters, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, forming up for an attack on the bombers. The rational move would have been to rejoin his section or stay high and cover the heavies from possible bounce. He dove alone into their formation instead. Gun camera footage and combat reports from that day, later cross-checked with Japanese loss records, show him destroying 5 Zeros in 12 minutes. He landed back at Piva with 14 bullet holes in his F4U and 3 gallons of fuel left in the tanks. Avalanche. On January 20th, he added another 0 to his tally. On January 22nd, 2 Zeros and a Ki-61 Tony went down under his guns. On January 24th, over Simpson Harbor again, he got cut off from his division a second time. Alone, he attacked multiple enemy fighters menacing the strike group and shot down 4 Zeros. His Medal of Honor citation, written later, would describe these mid-January actions in restrained language, waging a lone and gallant battle against highly maneuverable hostile interceptors, striking with devastating fury. In the ready rooms and tent bars on Bougainville, the language was less formal. Butcher Bob. On January 26th, he claimed 3 more zeros. 16 days, 21 confirmed kills. A rampage unmatched in the theater. By the end of that month, his total stood at 21. In a war where 15 made you an ace many times over, he was now in rare company. His background only added to the legend, the India-born son of missionaries who had become a college wrestling champion and then al-fam. Most casually, one of the most lethal fighter pilots in the Pacific. Among other pilots, the reaction was complicated. On the one hand, you don't argue with results. Every bomber that made it home because an intercept had been blown apart by a single Corsair was a reason to lift a glass in the mess. On the other, Hanson flew with a kind of cold, almost mathematical aggression that made more conservative men uneasy. Marine Corps fighter doctrine in 1944 was clear. Work as a team. Maintain section integrity, protect the asset, the bombers. With the F4U, use speed and altitude to dictate the fight. Never get drawn into slow-turning fights with zeros. Dive, fire, and climb away. Hanson violated that doctrine almost as a matter of instinct. When Japanese formations appeared, most section leaders tightened up their wings and called out bearing and altitude. Hanson tended to break towards the radio call and go hunting. He didn't merely accept combat. He sought it, closing willingly to ranges and angles that others avoided. Major Robert Owens, his commanding officer, recognized both the value and the risk in that. Twice in late January, Owens tried to ground him, pointing to his score sheet and telling him in blunt Marine terms that he had done enough. Hanson had a rotation date, February 10th. If he could stay alive another week and a half, he'd be on a ship back to the States. There were plenty of green lieutenants who could use the combat time, plenty of older captains who had families back home, and thought 21 kills was a fine place to stop pushing your luck. Hanson agreed in principle. In practice, every time the warning klaxon went off and the mission briefing board went up, he was there with his helmet and parachute like everyone else. January 30th looked at first like just another line on the big battle calendar. In hindsight, it would define the way his legend was told as much as any Medal of Honor citation. The briefing that morning at Piva North was short and blunt. Attack on Simpson Harbor. 18 TBF Avengers from a Navy squadron, torpedoes aboard, target shipping in the anchorage, approach from the southeast across the northern tip of Bougainville, then over open water. Fighter cover, 8 F4U-1s from VMF 215. Enemy situation, Rabaul's radar and observers would see them coming. 70 or so fighters on the ground in the area. Expect a massive reaction. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the harbor, heavy flak and light guns. Bombers would cruise at around 12,000 feet on the run-in. Corsairs to take high cover at 15,000, weaving and watching for interceptors. Someone cracked a weak joke about drawing lots for who got which Avenger to cover. It fell flat. At 6:15, as the eastern sky just began to gray over Bougainville, Hanson strapped into his assigned F4U-1 on the coral strip. Bureau number 56039, his usual mount for the past month. Its battered dark blue skin bore fresh patches and still had faint cordite streaks near the gun ports from the last sortie. This particular Corsair had carried him through 6 consecutive missions over Rabaul without failing him. It was a known quantity. In a business where the margin between life and death sometimes came down to whether a supercharger kicked in cleanly at altitude or a gun feed jammed, that familiarity mattered. The big Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp up front coughed, belched smoke, then caught on the third blade. Hanson felt the vibration come up through the seat as 2,000 horsepower settled into a loping idle. Around him, the other 7 Corsairs in the section and the line of Avengers shook themselves awake. By 0648, he was taxiing into position behind the lead Corsair. One by one, the fighters and then the TBFs clawed their way into the dense morning air, climbing away from Bougainville's jungle rid. And at 0730, the small formation crossed the northern coast of Bougainville itself. Ahead lay 90 miles of open sea to Simpson Harbor. Hanson did what fighter pilots have always done in those long minutes between takeoff and contact, checked his machine. Fuel selectors correctly set, oil temperatures and pressures in the green, supercharger functioning, harness snug, guns armed. 6 Browning AN M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, each with roughly 400 rounds, 2,400 rounds total. They were set for a convergence point at about 300 yards, where their streams would intersect and shred anything unlucky enough to be there. He squinted eastward into the rising sun. On the radio, the bomber leader called out their approach vector and made minor formation corrections. The Corsair pilots checked in on the escort frequency. Then, somewhere ahead and to the north, spotters on Bougainville and perhaps radar operators in caves near Rabaul saw what was coming. Bandits, 2-1 climbing out of Rabaul, came a voice on the warning net, relayed to the strike group. 21 Japanese fighters climbing through 9,000 feet, fanning out to intercept. Through breaks in the clouds, they could be picked out by experienced eyes and good binoculars from shore, mostly Mitsubishi A6 M0s, 17 of them, according to late accounts, and 4 Nakajima Ki 44 Shoki interceptors, known to the Americans as Tojos. The Zero was, by 1944, well known to Allied pilots. Light, fragile, frighteningly maneuverable. Top speed around 331 miles an hour at altitude. Climb rate on the order of 3,000 feet per minute. 220 millimeter cannon in the wings and a pair of 7.7 millimeter machine guns in the nose. In a pure turning fight at similar speeds and altitudes, it could dance inside any American fighter's circle. The Ki 44 was something else again, a stubby, high-performance interceptor built around a big Nakajima radial. It couldn't turn with a Zero, but it could climb like a scalded cat, and had heavy armament. Against that, the Corsair brought its own numbers. Top speed around 417 miles an hour. A solid 80-plus miles an hour advantage in level flight over the Zero at most altitudes. A brutal initial dive rate, thick armor around the cockpit and engine, self-sealing tanks, 650 cals concentrated in the wings. Marine doctrine on how to use that advantage was drilled into every F4U pilot from day one. Never try to outturn a Zero. Stay fast, stay high. Use altitude and speed, energy to make slashing attacks from above, then climb away. Don't get slow. Don't try to dogfight in their arena. For the Avengers below, doctrine was simpler. Hug your altitudes, stay in formation, and trust the escorts. The bomber leader called out the enemy formation, high and to the north, 11 o'clock, slightly above them, angling in. The 8 Corsairs acknowledged. Then one of them did something the others had seen before. Hanson rolled his Corsair inverted and pulled. The 7 other F4U pilots held with the bombers. Some clenched their teeth, wanting to follow him, feeling every scrap of training tugging at their hands to maintain their assigned roles. They had seen this pattern from Hanson before. He would dive into the heart of a Japanese formation, kill the leader or scatter the group, and in doing so, force most of the enemy fighters to break off their attack on the heavies and chase him instead. It was tactically sound, in the cold calculus of escort work. One fighter knowingly sacrificing potential survival odds, putting himself into the middle of the hornet's nest in order to disrupt a coordinated interception aimed at 18 big vulnerable aircraft. It was
also, by any statistical analysis, madness. Hanson's Corsair gathered speed in the dive. 350 miles an hour, 400. The airframe hummed. His harness bit into his shoulders as he trimmed for the dive. He picked his initial target, the lead Zero in the Japanese formation, kill the leader, and the rest hesitate. Even half a second of hesitation at this closure rate might be the difference between them hitting the Avengers cleanly and going wide and scattered. At around 800 yards, the lead Zero's pilot must have seen the flash of blue and white barreling in out of the sun. The formation began a lazy left turn, the beginnings of an evasive maneuver. Too late. Hanson had altitude, speed, and surprise. The Zero in his sight picture grew rapidly. 600 yards, 5. He waited, fingers poised on the triggers built into his control stick. 400. He steadied the sight just ahead of the Zero's nose, anticipating its turn, and squeezed. All 6 Brownings opened up. The Corsair's nose jerked slightly with the recoil. Bright white tracers lanced out, angling down to meet the Japanese fighter. At 300 yards, the convergence distance his armorers had set, those 6 disparate streams intersected at a point just ahead of the Zero's cockpit. Bullets chewed across the engine cowling and into the forward fuselage. Bits of sheet metal and cowling flew off. Black smoke gushed from the cowl flaps. A flicker of flame followed. The Zero shuddered, rolled onto its back, and spun away, trailing an ugly black smear. 1 down, 20 remaining. Hanson didn't watch it fall. He pulled through the Japanese formation, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat as he leveled at about 5,000 feet under them, then yanked back and rolled, converting his speed back into altitude in a climbing turn. Above and behind him, the Japanese formation exploded into motion. The clean, three-dimensional geometry of the intercept shattered. Some fighters broke right, some left. A few dove. 15 of them, though, reacted exactly the way he'd counted on. They turned after the unexpected threat that had just torn their leader out of the sky. 6 more held to their original attack vector, continuing toward the Avengers. The tactical goal, disrupting the intercept, was achieved. The torpedo bombers had, for the moment, breathing room. Now 1 Corsair had 15 fighters on its tail. From the ground in Rabaul's harbor defenses, the fight above Simpson Harbor that morning must have looked like a swarm of angry insects tangled in invisible threads. From Hanson's cockpit, it was a set of angles and energy states. The closest Zero was about 400 yards behind him when he leveled out after that first pass. At his current power setting, in level flight, the Corsair could walk away from a Zero, given a bit of time. The problem was that he wasn't in level flight. He was climbing to get back above his pursuers, and in a pure climb, the Zero's superior power to weight and lower wing loading gave it an edge. The distance shrank. 350 yards, 300. At roughly 280 yards, the lead Zero opened fire. Tracer rounds zipped past Hanson's canopy, streaks of orange and white. He heard the dull thunks and metallic pings of hits on his aircraft. 1 round punched neat through the Corsair's vertical stabilizer, sending a brief tremor through the rudder pedals. Another hit the left wing root, tearing away a small triangular flap of skin. Neither strike hit anything vital. No fuel, no hydraulics, no control cables. Hanson pushed the throttle full forward. The R-2800 in front of him roared, the prop biting deeper into the slipstream. Manifold pressure edged against the red line. Still, physics was what it was. He was trading speed for altitude. The Zero was closing the gap faster than he could open it. At around 240 yards, well inside effective range for 20mm cannon, Hanson made a decision. He snap-rolled right. The F4U's big wings had quirks, but one of their advantages was a vicious initial roll rate at speed. Whereas Zero's ailerons began to stiffen as compressibility and airflow increased, the Corsair could still muscle through. Hanson threw the stick over, kicked a touch of rudder, and let the aircraft flick into a quickly banked roll. The Zero pilot behind him tried to follow. His aircraft responded, but not as quickly. Hanson completed the roll and immediately pitched his nose down into another shallow dive, straightening out on a different vector.
Instantly, the geometry of the chase changed. The Zero was still behind him, but now slightly high and offset out of its sweet spot for a firing solution. Its pilot had to bank and correct again, bleeding a bit of speed. Hanson's Corsair, on the other hand, was back into a descending flight path, building up speed again. The range crept back up, 260, 300. He leveled briefly at about 3,000 feet, then pulled the nose up into a steep climb, almost vertical. 4,000 feet, 5, 6. His airspeed indicator unwound, 300 make it, 280, 260, 220. At the top of the climb, the Corsair was on the edge of a stall, nose high, wings beginning to shudder. Hanson kicked the rudder and pushed the stick, rolling the aircraft over the top in a kind of off-center hammerhead. For a moment, his cockpit was upside down relative to the earth, the harness biting his shoulders. Through his canopy, he saw the Japanese fighters below, some climbing, some turning, spraying the sky with tracer fire at where he had been, not where he now was. He picked one of the higher pursuers, a Ki-44 Tojo that had overshot slightly during the last maneuver, and let the nose fall across its projected future position. Then he fired. Accounts of that dogfight differ in the details. Gun camera film from Hanson's aircraft for that mission, if it existed, was not preserved in full. Japanese records from Rabaul in late January 1944 are spotty, filtered through destruction, loss, and language. What is clear from surviving American combat reports and squadron logs is that in the next several minutes over Simpson Harbor, Hanson fought almost continuously. He used the Corsair as it had been designed to be used, as an energy fighter, diving to attack, climbing or rolling away, refusing to get sucked into flat, low-speed turning contests where the Zeros dominated. From the top of that hammerhead, he dropped back through the loose cluster of pursuers, his guns catching a Tojo in a brief 6-gun burst that shredded its starboard wing. The Japanese interceptor rolled over and fell, smoke and flame trailing. He leveled, then rolled left into a climbing turn to meet a pair of Zeros that had tried to climb above him. His first burst cut the tail clean off one. The second walked across the other's cockpit, the canopy exploding outward. That Zero flared, then nosed down, pilot likely dead or dying. Meanwhile, below and to the east, 6 enemy fighters that had not taken his bait had reached the Avengers. From Hanson's vantage point as he completed his second firing pass, flashes of tracer fire marked where those interceptors were weaving in among the torpedo bombers. Worse, puffs of black and gray flak blossomed around the lumbering TBFs as harbor batteries got the range. He could stay with the gaggle of fighters behind him and trade kills for time, or he could drop back toward the bombers and try to knock the most dangerous attackers off them. There was never really a question which option he'd choose. He rolled the Corsair into a shallow dive toward the Avengers. The TBFs flew in 2 loose armations, staggered in altitude by a few hundred feet. Their pilots had their hands full just keeping their aircraft in position and stable. Each had a pilot, a radio man gunner in the rear, and sometimes a turret gunner. 3 men whose bodies would, if those planes started going down in flames over Simpson Harbor, hit the water hard. 4 Zeros and 2 Tojos were slashing in and out of their boxes, trying to get deflection shots that would saw off wings or set fuel tanks alight. Tracers stitched across bomber fuselages. A white spray marked where one Avenger had taken a hit and vented fuel. Hanson came in from above and behind, nose slightly low, throttle wide. The first Zero in his path never saw him. Focused on an Avenger's tail, the Japanese pilot held his turn a fraction too long. Hanson's 6 guns hammered, rounds ripping across the Zero's fuselage and into its wing roots. The fighter folded its left wing and cartwheeled, disintegrating. The Tojo ahead of it broke hard right, but not decisively enough. Hanson pulled lead and fired a long burst at the point the Ki-44's path would intersect. Hits walked up its fuselage. Pieces flew off, smoke trailed. The interceptor dove away, streaming fuel. The remaining 2 Zeros jinked, overshot their bomber targets, and reflexively climbed to avoid colliding with friendly aircraft. That climb put them right back where Hanson wanted them. below and ahead, trading speed for altitude. He zoomed up past them, rolled, and dropped onto the tail of the trailing Zero. The Japanese pilot tried to haul into a brake turn. The F4U stayed outside his circle, guns chatting. The Zero snapped over and fell, a fireball blooming briefly where it struck the sea. Time was elastic in that kind of fight. Later, men would argue over how long it had really lasted. Some said minutes, others swore it had been half an hour. What matters is that by the time the Avengers reached the edge of the flak curtain above Simpson Harbor and began their attack runs, most of the fighters that had originally been in position to make that approach a slaughter were either burning, diving away damaged, or tangled with one very busy Corsair. The Avengers rolled in. Below them, Japanese ships in Simpson Harbor, cruisers, destroyers, transports, filled the air with lead. Flak blossomed in ragged black clouds. Waterspouts leapt beside hulls. Torpedoes dropped and then streaked in at their ungainly 30 or 40 knot clip under the surface. Some found nothing but mud. Others found steel. Pilot debriefs and post-strike reconnaissance photos would later show at least a few solid hits that day. Columns of smoke from stricken ships, listing hulls, one or two vessels gutted. Up above and slightly behind the retreating bombers, the sky was still full of swirling fighters. Hanson, low on ammunition now, with his fuel gauges dipping toward inconvenience, if not outright danger, was still trading blows. In the end, no one is entirely certain how many Japanese aircraft fell to his guns on January 30th. Some post-war accounts, carried along by the inertia of legend and the fuzz of memory, claim staggeringly high numbers: 5, 6, 8. Official credits for that day's mission, drawn up by squadron intelligence officers, peering at gun camera clips and cross-checking claims against what fragments of Japanese records later emerged, are more conservative. What's not in dispute is that Hanson engaged the interceptors around Simpson Harbor in a way that left both friend and foe shaking their heads. To Japanese pilots and controllers watching their plotting tables, it must have seemed as if one blue-gray Corsair had been everywhere at once, slicing through formations, erupting from blind spots, dragging pursuers into vertical maneuvers that bled their speed and exposed them to his guns. To the Avengers' crews, heads ducked in their cockpits or turrets, all it meant in the moment was that there were fewer Zeros shooting at them than there probably should have been. To the other 7 Corsair pilots, still tied to the bomber formation in ones and pairs, it looked like a man bent on balancing all the risk in the sky on his own wingtips. When they landed back at Piva that afternoon, dusty, low on fuel, flak-scarred, reports trickled in from multiple sources. Some Avengers credited the lone Corsair with saving our bacon. Others swore they'd seen him chased by a whole squadron and come out of it firing. Intelligence officers chewed over it, trying to reconcile radio logs and visual sightings. Then, before anyone could pin down exactly how that morning's scrap should be recorded in neat columns on an operations board, the war moved on. There were raids to plan for the next day, more convoys to hit, more fields to cover. Hanson flew again. 4 days later, on February 3rd, 1944, he did not come back. On that mission, flying cover for Marine and Navy strikes against targets near Cape St. George, New Ireland, Bob Hanson pursued a lone Japanese aircraft down to the deck. Accounts differ on whether it was a float plane, a small transport, or simply a glint he thought was an enemy. What's recorded is that he chased it across the water at low altitude, his Corsair's prop biting into the spray, wake curling off his wingtips. In the pull-up from that strafing chase, his F4U's left wing struck the surface. The aircraft cartwheeled and disintegrated, flinging wreckage across the waves. There was no time for a mayday call, no parachute, no raft. Search planes circled the area later and found only floating debris. The man who had survived ditching in front of Empress Augusta Bay, who had walked away from bullet-ridden aircraft more times than anyone had a right to, was gone in seconds. His total confirmed victories stood at 25. He was 23 years. The Medal of Honor awarded to First Lieutenant Robert M. Hanson after his death covered not one mission, but a period, January 1st to January 25th, 1944, during which he had, in the words of the citation, repeatedly engaged in attacks with unfailing courage and determination, often single-handedly against overwhelming numbers of enemy aircraft. The paperwork did what official recognitions always do. It compressed messy reality into phrases fit for display. Aircrew gossip and memory did the opposite. For years after, pilots who had flown the Solomon's Rabaul circuit told their own versions of the stories. The day he dove into 6 torpedo bombers off Empress Augusta and came out shot to pieces. The day he dropped out of formation over Simpson Harbor and scattered an entire fighter intercept by himself, the way he flew with both ice and fire in his veins. The story of one Corsair against 21 Japanese fighters, of that morning when he dove into an intercept meant for the Avengers and turned their tight pattern into a maelstrom, became part of that unofficial canon. The precise numbers matter less than the pattern. Every time he rolled off the top of a climb and went back down into the thick of it, he was doing 3 things at once: protecting bombers and other fighters whose job it was to hit the real strategic targets, adding to a personal tally that, while impressive, meant little in the grand sweep compared to ships sunk and airfields cratered, walking a tightrope between tactical genius and self-destructive audacity. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots who fought him, the tactic looked crazy. American fighters were supposed to use their speed and altitude to make 1 or 2 diving passes, then pull away, reform, and keep their distance. Hanson kept coming back. He violated their expectations as thoroughly as he did his own side's do. Doctrinal comfort zone, and in aerial combat, violating expectations is half of winning. From the perspective of a modern reader or viewer, it's easy to put him in one of 2 boxes: reckless glory hound or pure hero. The truth, as with most men who did extraordinary things in short spans of time, sits somewhere in between. He was a highly trained, highly competitive professional in an environment that rewarded aggression and killed hesitation. He was also a 23-year-old with a wrestling champion's confidence and a sense, in those brief weeks over Rabaul, that he was invincible. He wasn't. No one was on those routes into and out of Simpson Harbor. But for a few weeks in January 1944, when Japanese controllers at Rabaul saw Corsairs on their scopes, there was one tail code and one pilot's name that made them tighten their jaws a little more. When 21 fighters went up to meet a strike and watched one F4U roll out of the sun into their formation like a thrown knife, their response, their tactical training, their discipline met something they hadn't quite prepared for: a man who understood the same math they did and chose again and again to bet against it. The Pacific did not shock easily by 1944. It had seen Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the slot. But even in that hardened theater, the idea that on one gray morning over Simpson Harbor, a single Marine Corsair had dived into more than 20 enemy fighters and come out the other side with bombers still flying and multiple zeros burning was something that made men sit up and take notice. It still does.